Just to make this point before we get into this, I'm not a pathological hater of the F-35, but blind praise is as bad as blind hatred, so here we go. The F-35 has had a few problems over its lifetime. As a program, it's pretty much summed up by this clip from Yes Minister. But at the end of this program, there's an aircraft that all of NATO is willing to purchase. That is, if American politics can just calm down for 5 minutes. But the program is now mostly complete. So where exactly did the problems begin? The very early development went smoothly, although early risks were identified. When reading early Lockheed press statement, you get the idea that there is some unease with the nature of the program. The UK is mentioned constantly, almost like they were attempting to set up excuses to be used later down the line. This might sound like a conspiracy, but early feasibility reports had concern with the general complexity of the program. This, combined with the diverting interest of not only US military branches, but also with the UK over the 20-year development life cycle, had some in the US government concerned. But it should be nothing to worry about. They're just building 3 types of aircraft for ground and naval use. What could possibly go wrong? Concurrency. This is the word that will define all of the problems of the F-35, and it's where we will begin. To give a brief explanation, we need to go back to 2001. America is excited about having a new program with its fond memories of the F-15 and F-16 program from the 1980s. It is a happy time in the Pentagon. And then somebody crashes a plane into the accounting department, and everything gets very real very quickly. It takes a very long time to do things quickly, so an innovative solution is put forward. Why don't we just build and develop the F-35 all at the same time? This frankly brilliant idea did have a couple of flaws. Like, how exactly are you meant to build something whilst you're still testing it? What happens if testing reveals problems? How can you certify an experimental aircraft is safe? Do you really need 100 testing vehicles, and so on, the list of problems ever mounting? This is also where most people will stop at the program. There's all of the problems, they're all tied down to this, but concurrency died in 2010 when the Obama administration got tired of ballooning costs and negative publicity, so this can't be the entire problem. For most of the engineering problems from 2001 to 2010, they are secret. I imagine someday it's going to make a very boring book, but all of the problems the program encountered after 2010 are very public. And the first of the very public problems was heat damage to the tail of the aircraft from high-speed flight. It scorched the metal surface, weakened the structure, and ablated stealth coatings. So in 2011, when this was first identified as a problem, the go-to solution was seemingly just to ignore it, run inspections, and hope. It was a good plan, and it couldn't possibly come back to bite them later. And anyway, it doesn't really matter. If something does go wrong, the pilots can always just eject.
In the business, we call this foreshadowing.
The next problem was that the pilots couldn't see, which is probably quite important. The state-of-the-art heads-up displays aren't a new concept. They've been used on other aircraft with great effect, but with the F-35 being the fighter of the future, the technology was taken just a little bit further. Each of these helmets cost around 400 grand, so you would hope they work. So when the night vision was broken, they didn't sync properly to the aircraft, and problems with the avionics made them glitch out, whatever that means. You can see why some people might have had a problem. It's probably not a good thing that at 500 miles an hour flying through the air, your means of understanding your aircraft decides it doesn't want to work. From 2012 to 2015, Lockheed would have an internal crack at fixing the problem, and when they would fail, they would outsource the solution to BAE Systems for a second go. But after 3 years of hard work, you could now use your $100 million jet, so that was definitely an improvement, and nothing else could possibly go wrong. 1 year after finding the HUD problems, they were back to testing failures. I will defend the F-35 for a bit here. They weren't designed to dogfight, so the supposed lack of performance in training isn't actually real. There is also a problem with sources for a lot of these stories from 2013 to 2016. Most come from a group of people called the Fighter Mafia, and most prominently Pierre Spray, who at the time was working for Russian media, and he would push ideas that were irrelevant back in the 1980s onto a public that was getting angry that their $1 trillion jet wasn't exactly working. He would stop a lot of these stories in 2016 when something happened. I wonder what that was. Back in 2014, and it does have a problem with its ejector seat, and it's not the safest device in the world. There was no evidence that it would kill you, but you were certainly not going to walk away after using it. And I'm going to be honest, this news story is somewhat dumb. Aircraft ejection seats have never been the safest devices in the world. They are a bomb, a rocket and a parachute strapped onto a very uncomfortable chair. But in comparison to being burnt alive in the cockpit or spearing into the ground at Mach 3, an injured spine is an acceptable trade-off if you ask me. You do in fact get to live. This whole saga would wrap up after a couple of weeks in 2016 after everybody in the media forgot about the problem and moved on. Later that year, Lockheed was getting close to the scheduled delivery window, and they were racing to get planes finished and off of the assembly lines and into the hands of aircrews. There was a war on and they wanted live fire testing. There was just one problem. If you were using all of the parts to build aircraft, what parts are you using to maintain the ones that are currently operating? Very simple answer to this, you're not. Readiness rates in units operating F-35s hit as low as 20% in some cases. And with so many brand new fighters sitting idle collecting dust, the media is bound to get wind of the story. Domestic readiness rates were a service-wide issue in 2016, with them hovering around 40 to 50%. But not only was the F-35 considerably lower, people hadn't forgotten that it was massively over budget and were angry their new fighter was a bit of a hag queen, and a very expensive one at that. But as long as nothing else would go wrong with maintaining the aircraft, they would be fine, right? It's just a matter of building spare parts. 1 year later, the entire logistics backend for the F-35 would break into a million tiny pieces. The phrase "good enough for government work" comes to mind. The Autonomous Logistics Information System, or ALIS, crashed hard. Turns out when you rush programs, small insignificant details tend to get overlooked, like data security and general reliability. In the pursuit of getting things done at low costs, they had to buy a solution cheap, but buy it twice. The whole system would get replaced with a program called Odin in 2021, which I have to be honest, I have no hope in. Anytime someone gets an acronym to say something, all it means is it's likely to fall apart because time was dedicated to a name and not functionality. Along with the fact that acronyms aren't Scrabble. They don't need to make sense, they just need fewer syllables than the sentence they're attempting to shorten. It's now 2018, and they've successfully managed to get the aircraft into the hands of some military units. There's around 350 in total at this point, and they're finally getting flight hours. Having some of the pilots tripping balls when they're trying to fly the plane was now an emerging problem, and probably not the one many at Lockheed imagined. There was faults developed in the system that mixed oxygen for the flight mask and cabin atmosphere. Both an excess and a lack of oxygen led to a number of pilots reporting medical emergencies and landing their aircraft. Apart from that one guy in 2020 who rolled his aircraft on the runway doing $176 million in damage. I love in the report he's referred to as the mishap pilot, like it's one of those things that just sort of happens. For anyone wondering what the resolution of that story was, the Air Force concluded that the crash was in fact the pilot's fault and could have been avoided, but the media jumped to conclusions early and now I have to talk about it. Next, it's 2019 and the whole heat problem is back. Not overly surprising, they didn't fix it to begin with, but it turns out the media will only forget a news story for about 8 years. From what I can tell, this story revolves around the fact that a journalist looked at the limitations that had been placed on pilots during training exercises, and this had become a problem for some reason. The old excuse came back out that fixing the problem is going to be very expensive and not really worth the hassle, and then the story was forgotten. I am looking forward to the new story in about 2 years. That will undoubtedly bring up some brand new problem for the troubled F-35. From 2020 onwards, the problems have been some rotation of oxygen failure, lack of spare parts, and then pilots binning them, normally in that order. So get used to seeing those problems in the future. For anyone wondering, we're currently in the spare parts phase as the UK has 2 aircraft stranded, one in India and the other in Japan, along with relatively low readiness for F-35s in the US domestically. I imagine these stories will die down when reports into F-35 crashes from 2024 get published and the media has something new to talk about. This video may come across as negative about the F-35, and whilst it has run into some problems, this was always going to happen. The key lesson of the program was learnt in 2010, and the problems after that haven't been unique. If you're looking for problems with supplying equipment, the UK military cannot supply spare parts to the 13 Challenger 2 tanks operating in Ukraine. So by comparison, the F-35 isn't fraught with problems, and it isn't about to collapse any moment. Most of these problems come from the fact that militaries are demanding more get manufactured, and then they're getting angry that the parts used to make new planes aren't available to maintain current ones. Once the primary production is complete, this isn't going to be a problem, and as the program is set to last for the next 40 years, many of these problems are likely to solve themselves.